Thank you all for being here. It's a privilege to be speaking to you while you're eating, I think. And let's see now. Are we going to... Okay. How's that? Am I on? Yeah, as I said earlier, that's a metaphorical, that's a technical, not a metaphorical question. You can judge the other part of that. I just want to share with you some reflections on what I've heard over the last few days and point you in a direction which I hope you'll take as we begin to see the connection between corporate responsibility and the whole field of ethics. I was interested in Ernst right at the beginning yesterday talking about how do we commit to our values. I was interested in Michelle Green from the Stock Exchange talking about we don't have the metrics together for understanding what the values piece is all about. I was fascinated by Anil Karnani talking about the fact that you all are intensely confused about everything, including the name of your profession. And Martin Reeves just recently talking about the fact that ethics is not a reliable guide to trade-offs, and yet noting that the ethical premium is an important thing for companies to have. There's a confusion in the language here, and that's the thing I want to address. It has stimulated in me a question which I've asked of several of you around the conference in the last couple of days. Is it possible for a fully sustainable company with very high scores on all of the registers that you want to have for corporate responsibility to be completely unethical? And most of the people I've talked to said, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's true. We're not really measuring that. Now that leads to a very interesting question in my mind. If this is so, what are the implications of all of that? How many of you were here this morning to hear Cheryl Queen from Compass talk about the Immokalee workers and hold up her tomato and all of that, you remember? For those of you who weren't, this is the story about Compass, a very large food catering company, working with the tomato growers in Immokalee, Florida, to figure out a way that they could get perhaps just 1 penny a pound more for what they were picking, rather than working in nearly slave trade conditions. It was an inspiring story. We all loved it. We all saw on the stage not only the tomato, but the head of the Immokalee Workers Association, and said, yes, this is great. What if we were later to learn that the reason this came about, and they actually did get 1.5 pennies a pound through their relationship, what if we'd heard later that the original offer was for 3 pennies, 3 cents a pound, but that the grower passed a number of bribes to just the right people in the farm workers group, and now the farm workers get 1.5 pennies, and all of their leadership gets, quite a bit more. At that point, we would say, wow, all the conditions for social responsibility are there, and yet this doesn't feel right. This isn't what we thought this was all about. This is not the way we think about responsibility. My point is, we need a language of public discourse around this question of ethics and integrity and moral judgment. And I'm coming to describe this in my own writing as a third language. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. Several years ago, as the recession began to hit us in full force, I did a book titled The Ethics Recession, and subtitled Reflections on the Moral Foundations of the Current Economic Recession, which is a very dumb thing to do if you're a writer of books. You don't put the word current into the title of your book. And I assumed, wrongly alas, that this would have a short shelf life, and I actually rather wish that it had a short shelf life, and it hasn't. We are still in the midst of this issue, and still increasingly aware, as I talk to people and say, do you think this was just a question of economics? Were these really well-meaning, good, ethical people who just got caught by a wave they didn't understand? Or was there something fundamentally going wrong in the ethics structure here? And most people are willing to say, yes, this is a collapse of integrity. Right up to the point, by the way, of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission making that statement in its report earlier this year when it talked about one of the 6 causes of the recession as being a systemic breakdown in accountability and ethics. Now, the third language, how does that fit in here? We journalists Terry, you understand this. We journalists left to our own devices have two default languages. We either write the language of politics or we write the language of economics, and you can check that out on the front page of any newspaper any morning. We are either asking the question, where's the power, or we're asking the question, where's the bottom line? And that's how we began to talk about it in the summer of 2008 with the TARP funding and all of that kind of stuff being on the table. And by the way, few people remember one of the wonderful points of humor in that whole discussion. There was a lot of talk about what should we call this thing that finally became called TARP. And at the risk of interfering with your dinners, one of the interesting observations for that, one of the interesting options for that was that somebody proposed we call it the Battered Asset Relief Fund. You can work that out. It'll get to the back of the room slowly, but just think about the acronym there. Anyway, as we talked about that over the summer, we journalists were using the language of politics and figuring out whether there are actually the votes in Congress, and we were using the language of economics and trying to figure out what would happen if we made these investments. And that was fine until we got into the month of October. And that's when Alan Greenspan, you may recall, went before Congress and said he was shocked at what he had seen. 50 years of settled economic conviction coming down around his ears because what was happening here was not something that could be accounted for in the normal economic structures. And all of a sudden, as if on cue, sent by central casting, onto the stage walks Bernie Madoff. And the penny drops and people begin to think, wow, this is not simply well-meaning economics happening out there. There's something bigger. By the time you get to December, you have Tom Friedman writing, saying, we don't just need a financial bailout, we need an ethics bailout. What we were needing and what we were finding happening in those last few months of 2008 was that the language of journalism was beginning to shift. And rather than asking only where's the power or where's the bottom line, we were beginning to ask what's right. And that, of course, is the fundamental ethics question. My contention is that we will never understand this recession unless we ask that question. We won't understand it fully if we only ask about politics and economics. There is a third language that is essential, just as there's a third language that's essential if you're going to understand what's happening, unfortunately what didn't happen in Immokalee. By the way, that was an utterly made-up hypothetical. And I warned Cheryl Queen that I was going to use it ahead of time. She said, that's fine, but just make sure they understand it is hypothetical. So that hasn't happened, but had it happened, we would not have been able to account for it in our normal languages. Where does this finally leave all of you? What does a language of ethics let you do? Let me share with you 5 things that we've concluded over the years, the 20 years that we've been at this. The first point is that ethics is not compliance. Now, I realize that many of you work in firms where the ethics office is run, sorry about this, Paul, run by lawyers and run by people who basically are saying, look, here's the law and how do we comply and all of that. The best definition of ethics that we've run into over the years was penned by a British jurist in 1924 in the Atlantic magazine, a man named Lord Moulton, who simply described ethics as obedience to the unenforceable. Obedience to the enforceable, that's law. That's why you have compliance offices. Obedience to the unenforceable is why you don't go, well, to put it bluntly, this is my example, not Lord Moulton's. That's why you don't go into a supermarket. And just as the little old lady ahead of you is about to put her hand on the last available shopping cart, you rush up from behind, hip check her into the canned peas, grab the cart, and run off down the aisle with it. Now, why don't you do that? There is no law. Take it from me, I've checked the statute books in all 50 states. There is no law that says thou shalt not steal shopping carts from little old ladies. So apparently you're perfectly free to do it. But who would do such a thing? That's one of those things that people don't do. It's not about the enforceable structures. It is about the unenforceable but powerful canons of our culture that keep us from going off into that direction. If we miss that point, if we think that ethics is only about right versus wrong compliance issues, we don't have the language right, and we're not going to be able to interpret what's going on. Second point around that, ethics is basically about our values. It's really the application of our values to our decision making. If you apply finance to your decision making, you're getting one set of examples. If you apply various other things, if you apply our core moral values, you're getting something else. The work that we at the Institute are probably best known for these days is the work that we've done over 20 years in about 30 countries. I will still continue to phrase this as an hypothesis until we've worked in 180 countries, up to Gallup level survey standards. We have worked with Gallup and various others. And what we've concluded is that everywhere in the world you go and ask people, what for you constitutes ethics? Or what's your code of ethics? Or what does integrity mean? Or words, phrases of that sort. You hear the same values. There are not separate sets of moral values for different cultures. And when I tell you what they are, this will not surprise you. It's not rocket science. Everywhere you ask that question, you hear 5 things. You hear people talk about honesty, or a word like that, truthfulness, candor, transparency, something like that. You hear people talk about responsibility, which of course is the word that's fundamental to what you're doing here. You hear people talk about respect. You hear people talk about fairness. And you hear people talk about compassion. This apparently has nothing to do with gender. Males feel the same way as females on this. Has nothing to do with questions of race or ethnicity. Has nothing to do with one's political situation or one's economic status. And most interestingly, has nothing to do with whether on the survey work, on the survey demographic piece, you have said, I am deeply religious, or I have no religion whatsoever. This crosses all of those boundaries. This goes very deep. This is what it means to be human in that sense. Now, if those values are universal, that may be one of the most important things that you take away from this talk tonight. Because if this were not true, none of your corporations would have any intellectual footing for creating an ethics office. Because anybody from any other culture could legitimately come to you and say, those aren't my values. Don't try to impose your values on me. And in fact, you're safe on that. As long as your ethics code is around these values, you've got that sense of universality that really works. Third point, you're now in a position, now that you understand those 5 values, to figure out where ethical questions come from, and they come from 2 things and only 2. You can either depart from your values, and ethics therefore becomes a question of right versus wrong, as the dictionary says it is, which is perfectly true and not actually very useful to the people in this room. The far more important point about ethics is what happens when 2 of your core values come into conflict with one another, and you can't do both at the same time, and ethics is a question of right versus right. Those are the tough ones. The tough choices that you face are not ones where you routinely say, over here's the good, the beautiful, the noble, over here's the awful, the terrible, the miserable, and geez, I'm just torn apart. I can't decide which to do. This is an awfully tough decision. Nonsense. You don't encounter those decisions. The decisions you encounter are the ones where you say, that's the right thing to do, and that's the right thing to do, and I don't know what. I don't know how to sort this through. And that's where we need a language and a conceptual structure for making tough right versus right ethical decisions. Now, the case in point, the typical one in the corporate world, I hear versions of this all the time. You have an employee who's been with you for 30 years, absolutely dedicated, no family. Her work is her life. She lives at home alone with her 7 cats, and she just loves coming to work and doing what she has always done, which is to use a little sharp pencil and take notes on a piece of paper, and she doesn't get it about the corporate world, about the computer world. She's 2 years away from retirement. She's holding back the team that she's on, and there really is no other place to put her. What are you going to do? You have every moral right in the world to say we must honor the needs of the community, and the community cannot be dragged back in this situation. We need to find a way to let her go now. And you have every moral right to say this is an individual. Yes, you can let her go right now, but what are you doing to her mentally? What kind of message are you sending to somebody who's put that kind of loyalty into your work? And what message are you sending to the rest of the organization who watches you do that? Right versus right. Now you could leave it at that and say, gee, that's tough stuff, don't know what to do. In fact, there are simple ways to think that through, and let me just give you one hint about that. As we do these kinds of seminars with organizations, we ask people to bring their own dilemmas to the table. So we've heard, at this point, probably 45, 50,000 dilemmas. Or you could say we have. In fact, we've heard 4 dilemmas. There are four broad patterns that characterize these dilemmas. And once again, this is not rocket science. When I share these with you, you'll fully understand it. People get in, the drivers of our tough dilemmas are either, and there's no order to this, these are all a constellation, are either truth versus loyalty, or individual versus community, or short-term versus long-term. That one, by the way, hit my wife and me every time we took $1 out of our pocketbook until our youngest daughter mercifully graduated from college, where you've got to spend it now so we can all eat, or you've got to put it in savings so she can continue the education. And finally, the last one that needs no explanation to anyone who's ever raised a teenager, justice versus mercy. It would appear to be the sworn duty of teenagers, as I'm sure you understand, to persuade us that most things are a matter of mercy. Most things are an exception to the rule. And we as adults, of course, are going to have to say, no, most things are actually the expectation, not the exception. But we fight that out all the time. And the fact is we can't camp out on one side forever and say, I always go for the expectation. I always go for the exception. No. Justice versus mercy is one of those tough dilemmas where there's going to be right on both sides, and we have to sort this through. If we have a methodology for that, we understand how to deal with these genuinely tough decisions that are facing us increasingly as the world gets more complex, more digitized, as the speed of innovation takes us farther and farther away from settled law, and the law has to catch up. The compliance office isn't going to be helpful to us out there in that innovative space. The only thing we're going to have to rely on is the core values and our ethical perceptions of those things. Fourth point, people can have a great sense of values. They can work out wonderfully pure moral reasoning in their decision making. And if they don't have the moral courage to put that into practice, that's no different from having no values and making no decisions. It comes to the same thing. Moral courage is the catalyst. That's the pure element that allows this thing to really take hold. And moral courage is very simply defined. It is a willing endurance, that's the first point, of significant danger, that's the second point, for the sake of principle. Take away the third point about principle, the willing endurance of significant danger, that's ordinary courage, that's bungee jumping. All right, that's robbing a bank, that's doing something to impress your girlfriend. Put in the values piece, and you've got moral courage. And by the way, don't be confused about the notion, the concern about courage and fear. One of the great definitions of courage comes from the great American philosopher John Wayne, who said, courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. Don't assume that somehow these t-shirts that the kids wear that say no fear, they don't get it. That's not courage. If there is no danger at all, we don't count that as courage. You will understand in your positions that there is a great deal of danger to you personally as corporate ethics officers trying to push against the inertia of a company that is really quite good. Not perfect, but quite good. Because what comes back is, gee, we're doing fine. You know, I mean, we have a small carbon footprint right now. I mean, what do you keep pushing the envelope for? Why are you making such a nuisance of all of this? The moral courage that it takes for you folks to have accomplished what you've done is remarkable. And I applaud you for it. Finally, the last thing. All of these things fit together. The values piece, the decision piece, and the moral courage piece in a kind of a constellation that provides what I think is finally the end game for where you people are going. You are not simply trying to create a better world right now. You're not simply trying to do something about a certain set of numbers within your organization right at this moment. You are trying to do what we up in New England describe with the old aphorism that says you should always leave the woodpile higher than you found it. You're trying to create a culture of integrity. Not just individuals of integrity, but a culture of integrity that lasts beyond the individuals themselves. And one of the surprising things, and I hope it doesn't ruffle too many feathers here, one of the surprising things is that culture itself is almost immeasurable by the normal numeric standards. Culture gets transmitted through narrative, through stories. And you can test that for yourself at any point. Talk to somebody about the culture of their organization, and they'll start with a lot of numbers and descriptors and attributes and all of that. But sooner or later, they will default to the narrative. I'll tell you what this culture is about. I remember the day I walked into my boss's office. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We just heard, and the story goes on, and it's a story about here's who we are, here's what we mean, here's to define culture in the best way you can, here's how we do things around here, and how we do them is ethical. I want to leave you with just one tale that illustrates, for me, the power of that kind of narrative. I'm working on a book right now on this whole question of how we build cultures of integrity, and for that I went back to one of our oldest, longest-standing clients, the J.M. Smucker Company, the people you meet every morning on the table with the strawberry jam and all of that. Wonderful little company in Ohio that's been there for over 100 years. I wanted to find out what I could learn about the culture, and one of the people I talked to was the former head of the union. He told me a bit about what it felt like to work there, and he could have gotten paid much better in other places and all of that, but finally he defaulted to a story. And he told me a story about Paul Smucker, who was then the head of the organization, the father of the two sons who are co-CEOs at this point. And he told about the time that there was a tough union negotiation going on, and the union committee that my friend was describing to me met and invited Paul to come in and give them his sort of financial synopsis for where things were headed. And he came in about 9:30 at night and chatted with them for a while, and basically said, it's going to be a tough year. I mean, we'll make it, but I just want you to understand what the economic structures are and what the difficulties are, and laid out the challenges. They talked for half an hour. He left. It's now about 10 o'clock, and he walked back over to his office, said John, the one I was talking to. And John and his friends were talking about what they'd heard, when 15 minutes later there was a knock on the door. And John thought that was odd, because it was now 10:15, and he got up and opened the door, and there was Paul. And Paul said, can I come in? And he said, sure, please, come in. What's on your mind? And John said, what he remembered, what he told me, quoting Paul, was Paul came in and said, I was walking back to my office, and I thought to myself, I think I hit that one a little hard. I mean, it is going to be a tough year, but I think I left you with the impression that it was going to be a tougher year than it is, and I just thought I needed to correct that. Now that, for a CEO in the middle of a labor negotiation, is a very interesting stand to take. And what's interesting to me is that that's the story that 30 years later, John has in mind when he says, this is who we are. This is the culture. But the kicker to this story is that the next day I sat down with his two sons, the CEOs, and I told them this story. They'd never heard it. The narratives that we're building around our culture are powerful, they're unique, they are all over the place. They're not only the big stories that everybody knows, they're the little stories in the background. Because that's where culture lives. Culture doesn't live in the C-suite. It lives right through the organization. And a good organization, actually, those of you who are CEOs could take some concern about this. A good culture is actually CEO-proof. Bring in a bad CEO and the culture will spit that person out pretty quickly, if the culture is really the culture of integrity. That's, it seems to me, your role. That's where you're going. That's why the ethics language, the third language, has to be so integrated into what you're doing that there's no longer a distinction between the ethics office and the corporate responsibility folks. That's why this is all one message, it seems to me. And the stories that are laid down here, of course we can measure them to the extent that we can, but don't overlook the power of the narratives that really tell us who we are as we move into this most remarkable new century. Thank you.